"She cannot afford to keep this house," my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm and measured, as if she were stating something obvious, something already understood by everyone in the room. And I remember how the words did not echo, did not demand attention, but simply settled into the space around us, quiet and certain, like a decision that had already been made. I stood beside my husband's casket, my hands resting gently against each other, the scent of white lilies filling the air, and I did not turn to look at her right away, because sometimes it is not the volume of a statement that reveals its meaning, but the confidence behind it, the assumption that no one will challenge it. Richard stood just a few feet away, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral, and he did not correct her, did not even shift in a way that suggested hesitation, and that silence, more than anything else, told me exactly where he stood, because silence, when it comes from your own son, is rarely accidental. I kept my eyes on the polished wood of the casket, on the engraved name that reflected years of shared life, and I let a few seconds pass before I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if I had heard something practical, something ordinary, something that did not require a response. Around us, people spoke in soft voices, offering condolences, exchanging quiet memories, believing this moment was about loss, about respect, about honoring a man who had spent decades building something steady and secure. And yet beneath that surface, another conversation had already begun, one that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with what would come next. I noticed the way Vanessa moved through the room, greeting guests with a composed smile, speaking with a kind of quiet authority that suggested she had already stepped into a role she believed was hers. And I realized that in her mind, the transition had already taken place, that this was no longer my home, my responsibility, my decision, but something to be managed, simplified, reassigned. I had arranged every detail of the service myself, from the flowers to the seating, from the printed programs to the final payment made earlier that morning, and not once had she asked how any of it had been handled. Not once had she wondered where the money had come from. And that absence of curiosity was not an oversight, it was an assumption, one that had already shaped the way she saw me. A distant relative approached, offering kind words, and I thanked him with a steady voice, my expression calm. And when he stepped away, I could hear Vanessa again, explaining gently that it would be easier if things were simplified moving forward, that too much responsibility could be overwhelming at my age. And there it was again, not harsh, not aggressive, just carefully framed concern masking a decision that had already been made without me. I did not respond, because response would have given weight to something that did not deserve it. And instead I allowed the moment to pass, storing it quietly, the words, the tone, the certainty behind them, because understanding does not always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from observation, from recognizing exactly how you are being seen. When the service began to come to an end and people started to leave, Richard finally approached me, asking softly if I was doing all right. And I told him I was, because I was just not in the way he expected, not in the way he had already decided. He nodded, relieved perhaps that I was not making anything difficult. And I realized then that they were not prepared for resistance. They were prepared for compliance, for a version of me that would quietly accept whatever came next, without question. I looked around the room one last time, at the flowers, the empty chairs, the space that had held so many voices just moments before, and I understood that something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, because in a single sentence, spoken without hesitation, My daughter-in-law had revealed exactly what she believed about me. And once you understand what someone believes, you understand exactly how far they are willing to go. The drive home felt longer than it should have, even though the streets were the same and the distance had not changed. And I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, not rushing, not slowing, simply moving forward with the same quiet control I had carried through the entire day. Because there was nothing to react to yet, only something to understand. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had. Unchanged, solid, untouched by the conversations that had already begun to reshape it in someone else's mind. And I sat in the car for a moment before stepping out, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to feel the difference between what was real and what had been assumed. The front door opened with the same familiar sound, and the air inside was still, holding the quiet of a place that had not yet been disturbed by decisions. And I walked through each room slowly, not searching for anything, just observing the way the light rested on the furniture, the way everything remained exactly where it had been left, as if nothing had shifted, even though something clearly had. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and rested my hands against the surface for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me, and I thought about the way Vanessa had spoken, the certainty in her tone, the absence of doubt, and I realized that what stood out most was not the suggestion itself, but the fact that it had not been presented as a suggestion at all. It had been presented as a conclusion. I moved into the living room and sat in the chair my husband used to favor in the evenings, the one near the window where the light lingered just a little longer, and I could almost hear the quiet rhythm of those evenings, not as something lost, but as something that had always been built on careful decisions, not assumptions. And I remembered the way he used to say that not everything needs to be explained immediately, that timing matters more than reaction. My phone lit up briefly on the table beside me, a message from Richard asking if I had made it home safely, and I read it once before setting it back down without replying, not because I was avoiding him, but because there was nothing to say yet. Nothing that needed to be clarified before I understood the full picture. Instead, I stood up and walked upstairs, each step steady, familiar, leading to a space that had always belonged to both of us, and now belonged to me in a way that felt both quiet and absolute. And when I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, looking in not as someone uncertain, but as someone who was beginning to see things more clearly than before. I crossed the room and opened the drawer beside the bed, the one he had always kept in order, and inside was the folder he had once mentioned, not in detail, not with explanation, just a simple instruction to keep it safe, to remember where it was. And as I picked it up, I understood that the moment he had been preparing for was not about loss. It was about understanding, about seeing what had been put in place long before anyone else began making assumptions. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held the folder in my hands for a moment, not opening it right away, because there is a difference between knowing something exists and being ready to see it, and I realized that what I was about to look at would not just answer questions. It would change how those questions were even asked. And as I finally opened it slowly, I did so without urgency, without expectation, allowing whatever was inside to reveal itself in its own time, because some truths are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to be understood. I did not rush as I turned the first page, because there is a difference between reading something and understanding it, and what lay inside that folder was not meant to be skimmed or reacted to quickly. It was something structured, something deliberate, and I recognized that immediately in the way the documents were arranged, in the clarity of the language, in the precision of every detail that reflected the way my husband had always handled anything that mattered. There were accounts listed that I had never personally accessed, Statements that showed consistency over time rather than sudden change. And as I followed each line carefully, I began to see a pattern, not just of savings, but of intention. Layers of protection built quietly over the years, designed not for display, but for stability. And I remembered the times he had asked me to sign documents without explanation, not because he wanted to exclude me, but because he trusted that I would understand when the time came, when everything needed to be seen as a whole. I paused for a moment and let the folder rest in my hands, not because I was unsure, but because realization takes its own pace. And what I was beginning to understand was not just the amount itself, but the structure behind it, the fact that nothing here could be easily moved or influenced by assumption, that every part of it required my direct involvement, my decision, and that detail alone shifted something quietly inside me, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like a weight settling exactly where it belonged. My phone vibrated again on the nightstand, and I did not need to look to know who it was. The timing alone made it clear, because people tend to reach out when they believe they are close to resolution, when they think the next step is simply agreement. And I let it ring for a moment before it stopped, the silence returning just as quickly as it had been interrupted. I closed the folder halfway and stood up, walking slowly toward the window, looking out at the yard that had never once been a burden to me, no matter how easily that word had been used. And I realized that what had been said at the funeral was not a misunderstanding. It was a conclusion they had already reached, a version of me they had already accepted without question. And the distance between that version and reality was now something I could measure, something I could use. I returned to the bed and opened the folder again, this time reading with a different kind of focus, not searching for answers anymore, but absorbing what it meant, what it allowed, what it quietly secured. And I noticed that everything was structured in a way that could not be overridden, that nothing could be redirected without my consent, and that realization did not create urgency, it created control. I placed the folder beside me and sat there for a moment, not thinking about what to do next, but recognizing that there was no need to act immediately, because timing, once again, mattered more than reaction. And I understood that what they believed about me would continue to guide their behavior, that they would move forward with the same assumptions unless something forced them to reconsider. And that force did not need to be loud. It only needed to be precise. As I turned off the light and stepped out of the room, I felt something settle into place. Not relief, not satisfaction, but clarity. The kind that does not demand attention, the kind that simply exists, waiting for the right moment to be recognized. And I knew then that the next conversation would not be about defending myself. It would be about allowing them to see what had always been there, hidden not by secrecy, but by their own assumptions. The next morning arrived quietly, without urgency, but with a sense of clarity that felt deliberate, as if something had settled into place during the night, without needing to be forced. And I moved through the house with the same steady routine, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the light move naturally into each room as it always had, unchanged by the conversations that had already begun to reshape things in someone else's mind. My phone rested on the counter for a while before it lit up with a message from Richard asking if we could talk later, mentioning that Vanessa had already reached out to a real estate agent, that there were options worth considering. And I read the message slowly, not reacting, not forming an answer immediately, because what they were doing was not surprising. It was simply the continuation of what they already believed to be true. I replied with a short message, telling him they could come by in the afternoon. And I placed the phone back down without adding anything further, because there was no need to guide their expectations, no need to interrupt the direction they had already chosen. The hours before they arrived passed in quiet observation, not of them, but of the space itself, the house that had been reduced to numbers and decisions in their conversations, and I walked through each room again, not searching for anything, but confirming what I already knew, that nothing here had ever been uncertain, that everything had been built with intention, with care, with a structure that did not rely on assumption. When the doorbell rang, I opened it without hesitation, and Vanessa stepped inside first. Her posture composed, her expression calm but slightly more focused than before, as if she were moving with purpose rather than suggestion. And Richard followed, quieter, his presence more reserved, though still aligned with hers in a way that did not require words. We sat at the dining table, the same place where decisions had once been made with patience rather than expectation. And Vanessa began to speak almost immediately, outlining timelines, mentioning conversations she had already had, referring to potential buyers as if the process had already begun, her voice steady, confident, and practiced. And Richard added to it, speaking about practicality, about simplifying things, about moving forward before anything became complicated. I listened without interruption, my hands resting lightly in front of me, my expression unchanged. Because there is a moment when people reveal not just what they want, but what they expect, and this was that moment. When they finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that invites agreement, the kind that assumes it will be given, and I nodded once, acknowledging what had been said without confirming it, and I thanked them for their effort, for the time they had spent thinking through what they believed was best. And I told them I understood their perspective, that I could see how they had reached those conclusions. And I watched as a small sense of relief settled between them, as if they had anticipated resistance and were instead met with acceptance. I did not correct them, not yet, because correction has its own timing. And instead I told them I would need a few more days to finalize my thoughts, that I wanted to be certain before making any decisions. And Vanessa agreed quickly, her confidence returning almost immediately, while Richard nodded in quiet approval. And I realized that in their minds, the outcome had already been secured, that this was simply a matter of time. When they left, the house returned to its familiar stillness. And I stood there for a moment, not thinking about what had been said, but about what had been revealed. Because every word, every assumption, every carefully framed suggestion had confirmed exactly what I needed to know. And as I turned away from the door and walked back into the quiet of the house, I understood that the next step was no longer about observation. It was about action. Not loud, not immediate, but precise. The kind of action that does not announce itself, but changes everything once it is complete. The following day unfolded with the same quiet rhythm, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, not visible in movement or sound, but present in the way each decision now carried intention rather than observation. And I began the morning not by waiting, but by acting. Placing a call to the attorney who had worked with my husband for years, someone who understood the structure without needing it, explained, and when he answered, his tone steady and familiar, I told him I was ready to move forward with what had already been prepared, not urgently, not reactively, but with clarity. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply outlined the steps, confirming details that had already been established long before this moment, documents that required acknowledgement, protections that needed to be formally reinforced. And as he spoke, I listened carefully, not because I was unsure, but because precision matters when something is meant to remain unshakable, and each confirmation I gave was deliberate. Each decision aligned with what had already been built into place. When the call ended, I remained seated for a moment, not reflecting, not reconsidering, but allowing the finality of it to settle. Because once something is secured properly, it does not need to be revisited. It simply exists as it was intended. Later that afternoon, a message came through from Vanessa. Longer than before, more structured, outlining new developments, mentioning that she had spoken again with the agent, that there was growing interest, that timing could make a difference. And I read every word without interruption, not because I needed the information, but because it revealed something far more important than the details themselves. It showed that her confidence had not disappeared, only adjusted. That she still believed movement was possible. That progress was simply a matter of alignment. I placed the phone down without responding immediately and walked into the living room, standing near the window where the light fell softly across the floor, and I thought about how easily certainty can persist when it has not yet been directly challenged, how belief can continue forward even when its foundation has already been removed. And I realized that what was unfolding was no longer about what they wanted to do, but about how long they would continue before realizing they could not. When I finally replied, my message was simple, telling her that I had completed my own review, that everything had been clarified, and that we could discuss further if needed. Nothing more, nothing that invited assumption, nothing that confirmed direction. And I understood that those few words would be enough to shift the next conversation. Not dramatically, but inevitably. As the evening settled in and the house returned to its steady quiet, I moved through each room without pause, not checking, not adjusting, simply existing within a space that no longer required explanation. And I realized that the difference between what they believed and what was true had now been fully established, not in confrontation, not in argument, but in structure, in decisions made quietly and correctly, and that difference would soon become impossible to ignore. Not because I would force it, but because it would reveal itself exactly when it needed to, without effort, without resistance, just as it had always been designed to do. They came back 2 days later, not because I had asked them to, but because uncertainty tends to pull people forward when clarity is just out of reach. And when I opened the door, I could see the difference immediately, not in what they said, but in how they carried themselves, the confidence that had once guided their steps now slightly restrained, as if they were moving through a situation they no longer fully understood. Vanessa stepped inside first, her posture still composed, her expression carefully neutral, but there was a pause in her movement. A hesitation that had not been there before, and Richard followed quietly, his presence more observant now, less aligned, as if he were beginning to see something he had not noticed earlier. We sat at the dining table again, the same setting that had become familiar over the past few days. And this time, Vanessa did not begin immediately. She waited, just long enough to suggest that the direction of the conversation was no longer entirely hers to control, and when she finally spoke, her tone was measured, asking if I had come to a decision, if I felt ready to move forward with what had been discussed. I looked at both of them before answering, not to create tension, but to ensure that what I said would be understood without needing to be repeated. And I told them that I had indeed completed my review, that everything had been clarified, and that I now had a full understanding of my position, and I allowed that sentence to settle before continuing, because clarity, when introduced properly, does not need to be rushed. I explained that the structure my husband had put in place was not something that could be adjusted casually, that it was designed to remain stable regardless of circumstance, and that any decisions regarding the house or related assets required my direct and explicit approval, which had not been given, and I watched as the meaning of that statement reached them. Not instantly, but gradually, as if it needed a moment to replace what they had previously believed. Richard leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into something more reflective. And he asked quietly if that meant nothing could be done at this time. And I answered him simply, telling him that it meant everything was already exactly where it needed to be, that there was no requirement for change, no urgency to act, and no benefit in altering what had been carefully established. Vanessa remained still for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the table, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more controlled, asking if there was something they had misunderstood. And I told her that there was nothing they had misunderstood, only something they had assumed, and that difference, though subtle, carried all the weight it needed. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not the silence of expectation, it was the silence of adjustment, of recalibration, and I remained where I was, not pressing further, not adding more. Because once the foundation of a belief is removed, it does not need to be argued against. It simply no longer holds. After a few moments, Richard nodded slowly, as if accepting something he had not anticipated. And Vanessa gathered her papers without opening them, placing them back into her folder with a care that suggested they were no longer relevant in the way she had intended, and when they stood to leave, their movements were quieter, more measured, as if they were stepping out of a situation that had shifted beyond their control. I walked them to the door with the same calm presence I had maintained from the beginning, and as it closed behind them, the house returned once again to its steady stillness, but this time there was nothing unresolved within it, nothing waiting to be clarified, because what needed to be understood had already been placed exactly where it belonged, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the simple act of allowing truth to stand without interruption. The days that followed did not carry the same urgency they once had, and that absence of pressure revealed more than any direct conversation ever could, because when people are no longer certain of their position, they tend to step back, to wait, to reconsider, without admitting that anything has changed. And I noticed that in the way the messages slowed, in the way the tone shifted from confident suggestion to careful inquiry, Richard reached out again, this time asking if he could stop by alone, not to discuss plans, not to revisit decisions, but simply to talk. And I agreed without hesitation, because there is a difference between a conversation driven by expectation and one driven by understanding, and I wanted to see which one this would be. When he arrived, he stood at the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as if measuring something he had not considered before, and when he stepped inside, his posture was different, less certain, more reflective. And we moved into the living room instead of the dining table, not by decision but by instinct, because the space itself felt more appropriate for what this conversation had become. He sat down across from me, his hands resting loosely in front of him, and for a moment he said nothing, as if searching for the right way to begin. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, not hesitant, but careful, telling me that he had been thinking about everything, that he realized he might have made assumptions without asking, that he had followed a direction without fully understanding where it came from. I listened without interruption, not because I needed him to explain, but because recognition, once it begins, should not be rushed or redirected. It should be allowed to reach its own conclusion. He continued, saying that he had trusted Vanessa's perspective without questioning it, that he believed he was helping by moving things forward, and that now he was not sure if he had been seeing the situation clearly at all, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. I told him simply that assumptions often feel like certainty when they are not examined, and that clarity does not always come from being told. Sometimes it comes from stepping back and looking at what has been overlooked. And he nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding, the kind that does not require further explanation. We sat in silence for a moment after that. Not uncomfortable, not strained, but settled, as if the need to fill the space with words had passed, and in that stillness, I could see that something had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to alter the direction of what would come next. He asked then, quietly, if everything would remain as it was. if there was nothing that needed to be adjusted or reconsidered. And I told him that everything was already in place, that nothing had been left uncertain, that the stability he had once believed needed to be created had always been there, just not visible to him before. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been holding on to. And for the first time since the funeral, he looked at me without expectation, without assumption, simply with awareness. And that shift, subtle as it was, mattered more than anything he could have said. When he stood to leave, there was no urgency in his movement, no attempt to revisit what had already been understood, and as I walked him to the door, the space between us felt different. Not repaired, not restored, but real, no longer shaped by what had been assumed. And as the door closed behind him and the quiet returned once more, I remained there for a moment, not reflecting on what had been said, but on what had been recognized, because understanding, once it reaches that point, does not need to be reinforced. It simply remains steady and unchanged. The following days unfolded with a quiet steadiness that no longer carried uncertainty. And that difference was not something that needed to be spoken about. It was simply present in the absence of pressure, in the way communication no longer arrived with urgency or expectation, but with a careful distance that suggested a shift had already taken place. Vanessa did not reach out immediately after Richard's visit, and that silence itself carried meaning not as avoidance, but as recalibration, as if she were adjusting to a reality that no longer aligned with what she had once believed. And when her message finally came, it was different in tone, still composed, still polite, but stripped of the certainty that had once defined it, asking if we could speak again. Not about plans, but about understanding, and I read it once before, setting the phone aside, not out of hesitation, but because the need to respond had changed. It was no longer about guiding a direction, but about allowing space for recognition. I moved through the house with the same quiet rhythm, the same steady pace that had never been interrupted, and I realized that nothing around me had required adjustment, nothing had needed to be corrected, because what had been questioned was never the structure itself, but the perception of it. And perception, once clarified, does not require rebuilding, only acceptance. When we eventually sat down together again, the setting was the same, the dining table unchanged, the light falling in the same soft pattern across the surface, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and Vanessa began the conversation differently this time, not with proposals or timelines, but with a question, asking if there was something she had misunderstood, something she had overlooked. And I listened without interruption. Not because I needed to hear the words, but because the act of asking them mattered more than the content itself. I told her simply that nothing had been hidden from her, that everything had always been exactly as it was, and that the only difference now was how it was being seen. And she nodded slowly, her posture still composed, but no longer directed forward, no longer pushing. And in that moment, it became clear that the certainty she once carried had been replaced, not by doubt, but by awareness. Richard remained quiet beside her, not withdrawn, but present in a different way, no longer aligned with expectation, but with understanding, and I could see that the space between them had shifted as well, not dramatically, but enough to change the dynamic that had once guided their actions. There was no need to revisit what had been said before. No need to explain the structure or the decisions that had already been made, because explanation implies resistance, and there was none left, only recognition. When the conversation ended, it did so without conclusion, without agreement or disagreement, simply with a quiet acknowledgement that things would remain as they were, not because they had been defended, but because they had been understood. And as they stood to leave, their movements were slower, more measured, not uncertain, but aware of something that had not been visible to them before. I walked them to the door with the same calm presence I had maintained from the beginning, and when it closed behind them, the house returned once again to its familiar stillness. But this time, that stillness felt complete. Not waiting for anything else to be clarified, not holding on to anything unresolved, and as I stood there for a moment, I understood that what had changed was not the situation itself, but the way it had been perceived. And once perception shifts, it does not return to what it was. It simply settles into something clearer, something that no longer needs to be questioned. There was no final conversation that demanded resolution, no dramatic moment that required words to define it, and that in itself was the clearest indication of how everything had shifted, because when understanding is complete, it does not ask to be confirmed. It simply exists without resistance. The house remained as it always had, unchanged in its structure, unchanged in its purpose. And I moved through it with the same quiet presence, not as someone who had defended something, but as someone who had never needed to, because what was mine had never truly been at risk, only misunderstood. Richard's visits became less frequent, not distant, but different, no longer shaped by assumption or direction, but by a quiet respect that had not been there before. And when he did come by, our conversations were simple, not about decisions or plans, but about ordinary things, the kind that do not carry expectation, the kind that exist without needing to lead anywhere. Vanessa, on the other hand, remained more reserved. Her presence no longer defined by certainty, but by awareness. And when she spoke, it was with a careful tone that reflected a change not in her nature, but in her understanding of where she stood, and I did not challenge it, did not revisit what had already been revealed, because there was no need to return to something that had already reached its conclusion. Time moved forward without interruption, days passing in the same steady rhythm that had always defined this place, and I found that nothing needed to be adjusted, nothing required correction, because what had been questioned was never the reality itself, only the perception of it, and once that perception shifted, everything else naturally followed. I stood by the window one afternoon, the light soft against the floor, the same familiar view stretching out beyond the glass, and I thought about how easily people mistake silence for weakness, how quickly they fill that silence with their own conclusions, and how rarely they consider that what is not said is often the most deliberate choice of all. I had not corrected them at the funeral. I had not revealed anything when they first began to make plans. And I had not needed to, because the truth does not require immediate defense. It only requires the right moment to be seen. And when that moment arrives, it does not need to announce itself. It simply replaces what was assumed. Everything remained where it belonged, not because I had fought for it, but because it had never been theirs to move. And that difference, quiet as it was, defined everything that had happened, not as a conflict, not as a confrontation, but as a correction, one that did not rely on force, only on clarity. As the day settled into evening and the house returned to its familiar stillness, I understood that nothing more needed to be said, nothing more needed to be proven. Because what had been revealed was not just the truth of the situation, but the truth of how it had been seen. And once that is understood, it does not fade. It remains steady and unchanged, exactly where it has always been.